Hey there, welcome back to another journey into the sleepy side of Scripture. Whether you're winding down after a long day or finding yourself wide awake at an ungodly hour, I'm here to guide you gently through the dusty roads and difficult realities of biblical times. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the globe. There's something oddly comforting about knowing we're all drifting through these ancient stories together, separated by miles, but connected by curiosity. If this kind of gentle biblical storytelling helps you relax, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it genuinely brings you peace. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let's ease into tonight's exploration together. Picture this. The sun rises over the dusty hills of Galilee, casting long shadows across a landscape that hasn't seen rain in weeks. The air is already thick with heat, and it's not even mid-morning. You're standing by the shore of the Sea of Galilee, nets in hand, salt spray mixing with sweat on your weathered face. Your back aches from a night of hauling empty nets. Your hands are raw from rope burn. Your stomach growls with the familiar hollow ache of another meal you can't afford to miss, but probably will anyway. Then a man walks up to you. A carpenter's son from Nazareth, they say. Nothing particularly impressive about him at first glance. Dusty robes, calloused hands, tired eyes that somehow still hold an unsettling intensity. He looks at you, really looks at you, and says 3 words that will change everything. Follow me. And somehow, impossibly, you do. You drop your nets, abandon your livelihood, leave behind everything you've ever known, and follow this stranger into what will become 3 years of the most challenging, uncomfortable, and frankly terrifying experience of your life. Welcome to the reality of being a disciple in biblical times. Forget the Sunday school flannel boards and the gentle Jesus, meek and mild imagery. We're about to explore what it actually meant to follow Christ in first century Palestine. And spoiler alert, it was not a spiritual retreat with catered meals and comfortable accommodations. Let's start with the most basic challenge: survival. When Jesus called his disciples, he wasn't offering them a comfortable position in a religious institution. He was inviting them into a life of radical uncertainty. These men, mostly fishermen and tradesmen, gave up their steady incomes to follow an itinerant preacher who had no fixed address, no guaranteed income, and a growing reputation for saying things that made the authorities nervous. Matthew was a tax collector before he followed Jesus. Now, tax collectors weren't popular in first century Palestine, but they were certainly well fed. Matthew had a house, servants, fine clothes, and enough money to throw elaborate dinner parties. When he chose to follow Jesus, he traded all of that security for a life of wandering from village to village, never knowing where the next meal would come from or where they'd sleep that night. The Gospels tell us that Jesus had nowhere to lay his head. That wasn't poetic exaggeration, it was literal reality. The disciples learned quickly that following their master meant accepting homelessness as a way of life. They slept under the stars, in caves, on the floors of sympathetic strangers, wherever they could find shelter. There were no holiday inns, no booking apps, no customer service to call when accommodations fell through. And the weather didn't care about their spiritual mission. Palestine might seem perpetually sunny in our imagination, but the reality was far harsher. Scorching days gave way to surprisingly cold nights. The rainy season brought flooding that could trap travelers for days. Desert winds carried stinging sand that got into everything: food, water, eyes, lungs. The disciples learned to wrap their heads and faces like desert nomads, not for fashion, but for survival. Then there was the food situation, or more accurately, the frequent lack thereof. The Gospels record several instances of Jesus miraculously feeding large crowds, But what they don't emphasize is how often the disciples themselves went hungry. When you're traveling constantly with no fixed income and depending entirely on the generosity of strangers, meals become irregular and uncertain. The disciples often had to choose between eating and giving food to others who had even less. They learned to stretch a small portion across an entire day, to make bread last when there was no promise of more coming. They discovered which wild plants were edible and which would make them sick. They became experts at finding water sources and determining which ones were safe to drink. Peter, who had been a successful fisherman with his own boat and crew, found himself begging for food more often than he'd care to admit. The same hands that had once commanded respect on the docks of Capernaum now extended palm up towards strangers, hoping for enough bread to keep going another day. But physical discomfort was just the beginning of their challenges. Following Jesus meant becoming targets for suspicion and hostility from multiple directions. The Roman authorities saw any large gathering as a potential threat to public order. The Jewish religious leaders viewed Jesus' teachings as dangerous heresy. Local communities were often torn between curiosity and fear about this controversial rabbi and his growing band of followers. The disciples learned to read crowds quickly, to sense when curiosity was shifting toward anger, when questions were becoming accusations. They developed an instinct for back exits and alternative routes. They became skilled at blending into crowds when necessary and standing firm when their master's safety was at stake. John and James, whom Jesus nicknamed the Sons of Thunder, probably because of their hot tempers, had to learn restraint the hard way. Their first instinct when facing hostility was to fight, but following Jesus meant learning a different kind of courage. It meant standing firm in the face of threats while refusing to respond with violence. It meant accepting insults, stones, and worse, without retaliation. This was perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of discipleship. These were men from a culture that valued honor and reputation above almost everything else. To accept public humiliation without fighting back went against every instinct they'd been raised with. Yet Jesus consistently taught them to turn the other cheek, to love their enemies, to bless those who cursed them. Imagine the internal struggle Thomas faced the first time someone spat on him for associating with Jesus. Every fiber of his being wanted to respond with force, to defend his honor and that of his teacher. But he had to stand there, wipe the spit from his face, and respond with love. The disciples had to rewire their most basic emotional responses. And that kind of psychological reconstruction is exhausting. The uncertainty of their mission added another layer of stress. Unlike modern religious movements with clear organizational structures and defined goals, the disciples often had no idea where they were going or what they were supposed to do when they got there. Jesus would simply say, "We're going to the other side of the lake," and they'd pack up whatever meager possessions they had and follow. Sometimes they'd arrive in a town and find enthusiastic crowds eager to hear Jesus teach. Other times they'd be met with suspicion or outright hostility. Occasionally they'd arrive to find that word of their coming had preceded them, and the local authorities were already preparing a reception that didn't involve palm branches and hosannas. The disciples had to develop a kind of spiritual flexibility that allowed them to adapt quickly to rapidly changing circumstances. One day, they might be honored guests at a Pharisee's dinner table. The next day, they might be running for their lives from an angry mob. They learned to hold their plans lightly and their faith firmly. Andrew, Peter's brother, was particularly good at this kind of adaptability. As one of the first disciples called, he had the longest to adjust to the uncertainty of their lifestyle. He became the group's unofficial advance scout, skilled at reading the mood of a community and preparing the others for what they might encounter. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of discipleship was the gradual realization that following Jesus meant accepting the likelihood of a violent death. This wasn't something Jesus hid from them, he repeatedly told his disciples that he was going to Jerusalem to die, and that those who followed him could expect similar treatment. The disciples initially resisted this message. Peter even rebuked Jesus for talking about his coming death, earning himself one of the harshest responses Jesus ever gave to a disciple. But as time went on, as the opposition grew more organized and more violent, the reality began to sink in. Following Jesus wasn't just uncomfortable or inconvenient. It was dangerous in the most literal sense. They watched as John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin and forerunner, was arrested and eventually beheaded for speaking truth to power. They saw how the religious authorities became increasingly hostile toward Jesus and anyone associated with him. They witnessed attempts on their master's life and realized that their own lives were equally at risk. This knowledge created a constant undercurrent of tension in their daily lives. Every knock on the door might be soldiers. Every stranger asking questions might be a spy. Every invitation to speak in a synagogue might be a trap. The disciples learned to sleep lightly and travel carefully. Yet despite all these hardships, despite the hunger and homelessness, the danger and uncertainty, the disciples continued to follow. Why? What could possibly motivate someone to endure such hardship? The answer lies in what they witnessed daily. Yes, following Jesus was difficult, but it was also transformative in ways they never could have imagined. They saw the blind receive sight, the lame walk, the dead raised to life. They witnessed acts of compassion that defied explanation and demonstrations of power that challenged everything they thought they knew about how the world worked. More importantly, they experienced a kind of community and purpose that made their former lives seem hollow by comparison. Peter might have been more comfortable in his fishing boat, but he was never more alive than when he was walking on water toward his master. Matthew might have had more money as a tax collector, but he never had more joy than when he watched Jesus transform the lives of people society had written off. The disciples discovered that there are kinds of wealth that have nothing to do with money, kinds of security that don't depend on circumstances, and kinds of satisfaction that can't be purchased or planned. They learned that following Jesus meant trading earthly comfort for heavenly purpose, temporary security for eternal significance. But make no mistake, this trade-off came at a tremendous cost. The disciples paid for their decision to follow Jesus with their comfort, their safety, their reputations, and ultimately, for most of them, their lives. They endured hardships that would challenge the strongest faith and tested the limits of human endurance. As we drift off to sleep tonight, let's remember these men who left everything to follow a vision of the kingdom of God. They weren't superhuman saints who felt no pain or fear. They were ordinary people who made an extraordinary choice, and they paid for that choice every single day of their lives. Their story reminds us that true discipleship has never been easy or comfortable. It has always required sacrifice, courage, and a willingness to endure hardship for the sake of something greater than ourselves. The disciples of the first century faced challenges we can barely imagine, yet they persevered because they had encountered something, someone, worth any sacrifice. Sleep well, and dream of those dusty roads of Palestine where ordinary men learned to do extraordinary things, where fishermen became fishers of men, and where following meant more than just walking behind. It meant transformation, it meant sacrifice, and it meant discovering that some things are worth any price you might have to pay. The morning light filtered through the narrow window of the monastery scriptorium, illuminating the bent figure of Brother Thomas as he carefully copied yet another manuscript, warning against the perils of earthly love. His quill scratched across the parchment, recording the Church's teachings about the sinful nature of romantic desire. But even as he wrote, Thomas found his thoughts drifting to the merchant's daughter he'd glimpsed at market the day before. This was the impossible contradiction that defined romantic life in medieval times. Even those dedicated to God's service, those who had sworn vows of celibacy and devoted their lives to spiritual matters, were not immune to the natural stirrings of the human heart. But for them, such feelings weren't just inconvenient or socially awkward, they were literally damning, capable of destroying not only their earthly position, but their eternal soul. The Church's grip on medieval romance extended far beyond simple moral guidance. It was a comprehensive system of control that regulated every aspect of human sexuality and emotional connection. Canon law, the legal system governing church matters, had detailed provisions about who could marry whom, when they could marry, and under what circumstances. Marriage between cousins, even distant ones, was forbidden without expensive papal dispensations. Marriages could be declared invalid for reasons as arcane as one party having once been godparent to the other's child. The Church maintained detailed records of bloodlines and spiritual relationships, creating a bureaucratic maze that could trap even the most careful lovers. Consider the case of Eleanor and William, two young nobles whose families had arranged their betrothal when they were children. Years later, as their wedding approached, a zealous priest discovered that Eleanor's great-aunt had once served as godmother to William's uncle. This spiritual kinship, according to church law, made their marriage impossible without papal dispensation. The process of obtaining such dispensation could take years and cost a fortune that neither family possessed. Their love story, which should have been a simple progression from childhood friendship to married partnership, became instead a nightmare of legal challenges, family bankruptcy, and ultimately separation. Eleanor was married off to an older lord who could afford the church's fees for a different dispensation, while William entered a monastery, his heart broken and his future decided by ecclesiastical bureaucracy rather than human affection. The church's sexual paranoia reached truly absurd levels when it came to the practicalities of married life. Medieval religious texts provided incredibly detailed instructions about when married couples could and could not engage in intimacy. They were forbidden from sexual relations during Lent, Advent, feast days, fast days, Sundays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. When you calculated all the prohibited times, married couples were theoretically only supposed to be intimate for about 40 days per year. But the restrictions didn't stop there. Couples were forbidden from intimacy during the woman's menstrual period, during pregnancy, while nursing, and for a significant period after childbirth. They were also prohibited from sexual relations during daylight hours, and even at night, they were expected to approach the act with solemn reluctance rather than joy or passion. These rules weren't merely suggestions. Parish priests were expected to question married couples during confession about their adherence to these guidelines. Imagine the humiliation of having to confess to your local priest that you had enjoyed intimacy with your own spouse, or that you had been intimate on a forbidden day of the week. The very foundations of marital happiness were systematically undermined by a religious system that viewed physical pleasure as inherently corrupting. The psychological impact of this constant surveillance and regulation was devastating. Young people learned to associate their most natural feelings with sin and shame. They were taught that romantic love was a dangerous distraction from spiritual devotion, that physical attraction was evidence of moral weakness, and that sexual desire, even within marriage, was a necessary evil to be endured rather than enjoyed. This created a culture where authentic, emotional expression became nearly impossible. Couples who genuinely loved each other had to hide their affection, fearing that too much happiness in their relationship might be seen as evidence that they were prioritizing earthly pleasures over heavenly devotion. The church taught that suffering was spiritually beneficial, which meant that a joyful marriage was actually suspicious from a religious standpoint. The impact on women was particularly severe. Medieval Christianity had inherited from earlier traditions a deep suspicion of female sexuality. Women were seen as inherently more carnal than men, more susceptible to temptation, and therefore more dangerous to male spiritual purity. This belief system created an impossible double bind for medieval women. They were expected to be sexually available to their husbands for procreation, but any sign that they enjoyed this availability made them suspect as temptresses or even witches. The Church's teachings about female sexuality were contradictory and cruel. Women were simultaneously expected to be pure like the Virgin Mary and available like Eve after the fall. They were supposed to submit to their husbands' desires while maintaining spiritual purity, to bear children without appearing to enjoy the process of conception, and to be modest and chaste, while somehow also being appealing enough to attract a husband. These impossible expectations created enormous psychological pressure for medieval women. Many developed what we might now recognize as severe anxiety or depression, constantly worried that their natural feelings and desires were evidence of spiritual corruption. The Church provided no healthy outlet for these concerns, instead offering only more restrictions, more guilt, and more shame. The confessional system, which was supposed to provide spiritual relief, often made things worse for those struggling with romantic feelings. Priests, who were themselves celibate and often struggled with their own suppressed desires, were not well equipped to provide compassionate guidance about love and sexuality. Many seemed to view romantic confessions as opportunities to impose harsh penances and reinforce the Church's negative teachings about human affection. Young people confessing to feelings of romantic attraction might be assigned penances involving fasting, physical discomfort, or public humiliation. Those who confessed to sexual thoughts or desires could face even harsher punishments. The message was clear. Your natural human emotions are sinful, and the only acceptable response is shame and self-punishment. This systematic suppression of healthy romantic expression had profound consequences for medieval society. It created generations of people who were emotionally stunted, unable to form healthy intimate relationships because they had been taught from childhood that such relationships were spiritually dangerous. It contributed to high rates of domestic violence, as men who had been taught to suppress their emotions often expressed them through anger and aggression instead. The Church's control over marriage also had devastating economic and social consequences. Because marriages required church approval and expensive ceremonies, many poor people simply couldn't afford to marry legally. This created a large population of couples living together without church sanction, making them vulnerable to accusations of sin and social ostracism. Children born to such unions were considered illegitimate, which severely limited their social and economic opportunities. This created a vicious cycle where poverty made legal marriage impossible, which led to illegitimate children, which perpetuated poverty across generations. Even wealthy families were not immune to the Church's interference in romantic matters. The requirement for expensive dispensations and elaborate ceremonies meant that even noble families could be bankrupted by the process of arranging marriages for their children. The Church's marriage laws were so complex and contradictory that even careful families could find themselves inadvertently violating some obscure regulation, leading to costly legal battles and potential annulment of marriages years after they had taken place. The psychological warfare inherent in the Church's approach to romance was perhaps most evident in its treatment of courtly love literature. While the Church couldn't entirely suppress the human need for romantic expression, it could and did work to ensure that such expression was channeled in ways that reinforced rather than challenged its authority. Courtly love, with its emphasis on impossible, unconsummated passion, served the Church's purposes perfectly. It allowed people to fantasize about romantic love while ensuring that such fantasies remained safely separate from actual relationships. The literature of courtly love taught that true love was necessarily tragic, that genuine passion could only exist outside of marriage, and that the highest form of romantic devotion involved endless suffering and self-denial. This cultural programming had lasting effects that extended far beyond the medieval period. The idea that true love should be painful, that genuine passion is incompatible with stable relationships, and that romantic suffering is somehow noble or purifying, all have their roots in medieval church teachings about the inherently corrupting nature of human desire. As we look back on this dark chapter in the history of human relationships, we can see how the systematic suppression of healthy romantic expression created a culture of fear, shame, and emotional dysfunction that affected every level of society. The Church's claim to moral authority in matters of love and sexuality was built on a foundation of psychological manipulation and spiritual terrorism that made genuine human connection nearly impossible. Young brother Thomas, bent over his manuscript in that monastery scriptorium, was both victim and perpetrator of this system. As he copied warnings about the dangers of earthly love, he was reinforcing the very teachings that were causing him such internal torment. The irony was lost on no one, least of all the young people who found themselves caught between their natural human desires and a religious system that declared those desires inherently evil. This was the true nightmare of medieval romance, not just the practical difficulties of finding love in a harsh world, but the systematic destruction of the very capacity for healthy emotional connection. The Church had succeeded in turning love itself into a source of fear and guilt, creating a civilization where the most beautiful aspects of human experience were viewed as evidence of moral corruption. And yet, somehow, love persisted. Despite the overwhelming pressure to suppress and deny their feelings, medieval people continued to fall in love, to write poetry, to risk everything for moments of genuine connection. Their courage in the face of such systematic oppression stands as a testament to the irrepressible nature of human affection, and a reminder of how far we have come in recognizing love as a fundamental human right, rather than a spiritual danger. The church bells that marked medieval time weren't just calling the faithful to prayer. They were counting down the hours until confession, marking the rhythm of a spiritual surveillance system that monitored every whisper, every glance, every flutter of the heart. Because in medieval times, love wasn't just dangerous to your physical health or social standing. It was a direct threat to your immortal soul. Picture young Catherine, a baker's daughter in 14th century England, kneeling in the dim confessional booth. The air is thick with incense and fear. Through the wooden lattice, she can barely make out the outline of Father Benedict, but she can feel his attention like a weight pressing down on her chest. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," she whispers, her voice barely audible above the sound of her own heartbeat. "I have had impure thoughts about Thomas the miller's son." What follows is not gentle guidance or pastoral care, it's an interrogation. How often has she thought of him? What exactly did she imagine? Has she spoken to him alone? Has she touched him? The questions probe deeper and deeper, turning natural human emotions into evidence of spiritual corruption. The Church taught that romantic love was fundamentally selfish, a distraction from the only love that mattered, love of God. The very intensity that makes love beautiful was seen as proof of its sinful nature. If you loved someone with passion, with desire, with the kind of breathless devotion that medieval poets would later celebrate, you were loving them more than God. And that was idolatry. Father Benedict assigns Catherine her penance: 40 days of fasting, 100 Ave Marias, and complete avoidance of Thomas. She must also wear a hair shirt, a rough garment designed to cause constant discomfort as a reminder of her spiritual failings. The physical pain is nothing compared to the shame that now colours every memory of Thomas's smile. But the Church's control went far beyond individual confession. Marriage itself had been transformed from a social contract into a sacrament, which meant the Church now had final say over who could marry whom, when, and under what circumstances. The intricate web of canon law governing marriage was so complex that even learned clerics struggled to navigate it. Consider the concept of consanguinity, the Church's rules about blood relations. The prohibited degrees of kinship extended so far that in small medieval communities, finding someone you could legally marry became nearly impossible. Fourth cousins were forbidden. Anyone related through godparentage was off limits. Even spiritual relationships created through confirmation could invalidate a union. These weren't just theoretical restrictions. Church courts actively investigated marriages, sometimes years after they'd taken place. A couple who had lived peacefully together for decades could suddenly find their union declared invalid because some distant relative had been discovered. Their children would be declared illegitimate, their property rights voided, their entire lives upended by ecclesiastical bureaucracy. The Church also controlled the timing of marriage with an almost comic obsessiveness. Weddings were forbidden during Advent, Lent, Rogation Days, Ember Days, and the octaves of major feasts. When you calculated all the prohibited times, there were only about 90 days per year when the Church would permit marriages. And even during these approved periods, couples had to navigate a maze of paperwork, fees, and examinations. The marriage examination itself was a humiliating ordeal. Both parties had to swear before church officials that they were entering the union freely, that they understood their obligations, and that they harbored no secret impediments. They were questioned separately about their sexual history, their spiritual state, and their understanding of Christian doctrine. Women, in particular, were subjected to invasive questioning about their purity and their willingness to submit to their husbands. But perhaps most cruelly, the Church taught that even within marriage, sexual pleasure was suspect. The only legitimate purpose of marital relations was procreation. Any sexual activity that couldn't result in pregnancy was sinful. Even the missionary position was the only approved method, with church authorities warning that other positions showed excessive lust. Medieval penitential manuals, the handbooks priests used to assign punishments for sins, contained exhaustive lists of sexual offences and their corresponding penances. These texts reveal an obsession with controlling and regulating every aspect of human sexuality that borders on the pathological. Couples were told exactly which days of the week they could be intimate, which times of year were forbidden, and how they should feel about it. The Church's marriage courts became venues for the most intimate details of people's lives to be aired publicly. Disputes over impotence, infertility, or sexual incompatibility were heard before panels of male clerics who had theoretically never experienced sexual relationships themselves. Women were required to testify about their husband's sexual performance, while neighbours might be called to give evidence about what they'd heard through thin walls. These proceedings weren't just embarrassing, they were ruinously expensive. The fees required to bring a case before an ecclesiastical court could bankrupt a family. The Church's monopoly on marriage law meant there was no alternative. You either accepted the Church's judgment or lived as outcasts from Christian society. Even more insidious was the Church's teaching about the spiritual hierarchy within marriage. While the Bible spoke of husbands loving their wives, medieval church doctrine emphasized that wives must submit to their husbands not just socially, but spiritually. A woman's spiritual salvation was believed to depend partly on her obedience to her husband. Resistance to a husband's authority wasn't just defiance, it was a sin against God. This spiritual dimension added a layer of psychological torment to already difficult relationships. A woman enduring an abusive marriage couldn't simply see her husband as cruel. She had to consider whether resisting him might damn her soul. The Church taught that suffering in marriage might be God's will, a form of penance for sins committed in this life, or punishment for Eve's original transgression. The confessional system meant that these spiritual struggles couldn't remain private. Women were required to confess their resentments, their moments of resistance, their secret longings for different lives. These confessions were then used to reinforce the very system that oppressed them, with priests assigning penances designed to increase submission and acceptance. Young men faced their own forms of spiritual manipulation. They were taught that sexual desire was a weakness to be overcome, that true spiritual growth required the subjugation of physical needs. Those who couldn't achieve the ideal of celibacy were seen as spiritually inferior, forced to accept marriage as a concession to their weakness, rather than embracing it as a positive good. The Church's influence extended into the most private moments of medieval relationships. Couples were taught to pray before and after sexual relations, to approach physical intimacy with shame rather than joy. The Song of Songs, with its celebration of erotic love, was reinterpreted as an allegory of Christ's love for the Church, its sensual imagery stripped of any human meaning. This systematic suppression of natural human emotions created a culture of sexual dysfunction that would persist for centuries. People learned to distrust their own feelings, to view pleasure as suspect, and to approach the most intimate aspects of life with fear and guilt. The very emotions that should have brought couples together were transformed into sources of shame and separation. The Church's control wasn't just doctrinal, it was enforced through a vast network of surveillance that made medieval communities into spiritual panopticons. Neighbors were encouraged to report suspicious behavior. Priests used the confessional to gather information about parishioners' private lives. Church courts had the power to impose severe penalties for sexual misconduct, including public penance, excommunication, and even imprisonment. This system of control was particularly devastating for women, who bore the brunt of sexual shame and regulation. A woman's reputation could be destroyed by the slightest rumor of impropriety, while men who engaged in identical behavior faced far less severe consequences. The double standard wasn't just social, it was encoded in church law and justified through theological argument. And yet, despite this overwhelming system of control and surveillance, love persisted. People continued to fall for each other, to risk everything for stolen moments of connection, to find ways to express affection even within the constraints of medieval Christianity. Their courage in the face of such systematic oppression speaks to the fundamental human need for love and connection that no institution, however powerful, can entirely suppress. The church bells that marked medieval time weren't just calling the faithful to prayer. They were tolling for all the love that might have been, all the relationships that were crushed before they could bloom, all the human happiness sacrificed on the altar of spiritual control. In trying to save souls, the medieval church nearly destroyed the human capacity for love itself. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of medieval romance was how the very concept of love itself had been weaponized by those in power. The church didn't merely control who could marry whom or when intimate relationships could occur. It had fundamentally redefined what love was supposed to be, creating a toxic framework that would poison romantic relationships for centuries to come. In medieval Christian doctrine, earthly love was presented as a spiritual trap. The church taught that passionate affection between humans was not just potentially sinful, but actively dangerous to one's eternal soul. This wasn't simply about sexual desire, though that was certainly condemned. The very act of loving another person too deeply was seen as a form of idolatry, a misdirection of devotion that rightfully belonged only to God. Imagine trying to build a romantic relationship under these conditions. Every tender feeling had to be measured and weighed against the possibility of spiritual corruption. Every moment of joy with your beloved carried the shadow of divine disapproval. Couples were taught to love each other, yes, but only in moderation, only with proper restraint, and always with the understanding that their earthly bond was temporary and ultimately less important than their individual relationships with the divine. This created an impossible psychological burden for medieval lovers. They were expected to care for each other enough to maintain functional marriages and households, but not so much that their affection might interfere with proper religious devotion. The line between acceptable and sinful love was never clearly defined, leaving couples to navigate a minefield of guilt and uncertainty. Women bore the brunt of this theological assault on romantic feeling. Medieval Christianity had inherited from earlier traditions a deep suspicion of female sexuality and emotional expression. Women who showed too much passion, even within marriage, were seen as potentially corrupted by the same lustful nature that had supposedly led Eve to damn humanity. A wife who enjoyed physical intimacy with her husband too openly, or who expressed her love too enthusiastically, might find herself suspected of spiritual weakness or even demonic influence. The courtly love tradition that emerged in the 12th century, often romanticized today as the birth of romantic literature, was actually a symptom of this diseased approach to human affection. Because passionate love within marriage was viewed with suspicion, the only way to celebrate intense romantic feeling was to make it forbidden, impossible, and ultimately tragic. Courtly love stories invariably involved knights falling desperately in love with married women, usually the wives of their lords. These relationships were praised precisely because they could never be consummated without destroying everything the lovers held dear. The suffering caused by unfulfilled desire was presented as ennobling, as if the pain itself was what made the love pure. This wasn't just literary fantasy. Real people internalized these ideas, learning to see suffering as an essential component of true love. Happy, fulfilled relationships were somehow suspect, lacking the tragic nobility that marked genuine passion. The very concept of romantic love became associated with impossibility, secrecy, and heartbreak. The Church's control extended even into the most private moments of married life. Medieval penitential manuals, used by priests to guide confession and assign punishments for sins, contained extraordinarily detailed regulations about sexual behavior within marriage. Couples were told which positions were acceptable, which days of the week they could be intimate, and how they should feel about these activities. The underlying message was clear. Even within the sanctified bonds of marriage, sexual desire was inherently corrupting. Physical intimacy was to be approached with reluctance and minimal pleasure, engaged in only for the purpose of procreation. The idea that spouses might find joy, comfort, or emotional connection through physical affection was not just discouraged, but actively condemned. This theological framework created profound psychological damage that extended far beyond individual relationships. Entire communities learned to police romantic expression, watching for signs that couples might be enjoying each other's company too much or displaying affection too openly. Public displays of marital happiness could invite suspicion and social censure. Young people growing up in this environment received deeply conflicted messages about love and relationships. They were told that marriage was a holy sacrament blessed by God, but also that the feelings that naturally drew people together were spiritually dangerous. They learned to distrust their own emotions, to view romantic attraction as potentially sinful, and to approach the most fundamental human relationships with fear and guilt. The economic and political aspects of medieval marriage, harsh as they were, might have been bearable if couples had been free to find genuine emotional connection within their arranged relationships. But the Church's systematic assault on romantic feeling made even that small comfort nearly impossible. Partners who might have learned to love each other over time were taught to view such feelings with suspicion and to suppress them in favor of dutiful but distant cooperation. This poisoning of romantic love had consequences that extended far beyond the medieval period. The association of passionate love with sin and suffering, the idea that true romance must be tragic and impossible, the notion that women's emotional and sexual expression was inherently dangerous. These concepts became embedded in Western culture for centuries, even when the Church's direct control over marriage began to weaken. These psychological patterns persisted. The romantic literature of later periods continued to celebrate tortured, impossible love affairs while treating happy marriages as boring or somehow less authentic. The idea that love should be painful, that relationships should involve constant struggle and sacrifice, that women should be mysterious and unattainable. All of these toxic concepts had their roots in medieval Christianity's systematic destruction of healthy romantic feeling. The medieval approach to love was not just restrictive or harsh. It was deliberately designed to break the human capacity for genuine intimacy and connection. By making love itself suspect, by teaching people to fear their own emotions, by creating impossible standards that no real relationship could meet, the Church ensured that romantic relationships would be sources of guilt and struggle rather than joy and support. And perhaps most tragically, this system was justified in the name of spiritual purity and divine love. People were taught that by suppressing their earthly affections, by viewing their marriages as duty rather than pleasure, by learning to love God more than their spouses and children, they were achieving a higher form of devotion. In reality, they were being systematically stripped of one of the most fundamental human capacities, the ability to form deep, trusting, joyful bonds with other people. The medieval Church's approach to romance was not just about controlling behavior. It was about reshaping human nature itself, creating a population that was emotionally isolated, psychologically damaged, and completely dependent on religious authority for any sense of meaning or connection. The nightmare of medieval dating was not just about arranged marriages, disease, and social restrictions. It was about the deliberate destruction of love itself, the systematic teaching that the emotions which make life worth living were dangerous, sinful, and ultimately worthless compared to the cold comfort of theological abstraction. This was perhaps the cruelest aspect of medieval romantic life. People were not just denied the freedom to choose their partners or express their feelings. They were taught to believe that wanting such freedom was itself a moral failing, that their deepest longings for connection and intimacy were evidence of spiritual weakness rather than fundamental human needs. The legacy of this systematic assault on romantic love continued to shape relationships for centuries after the medieval period ended, and its echoes can still be found in modern attitudes towards sexuality, emotional expression, and the relationship between spiritual and earthly love. Understanding this history helps us appreciate not just how far we've come, but how much damage was done by those who claim to be protecting human souls while systematically destroying human hearts. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of medieval romance wasn't the physical dangers or even the social restrictions. It was how the Church systematically transformed love itself into a weapon of control, twisting the most fundamental human emotion into something shameful, dangerous, and spiritually corrupting. Picture this. You're a young woman in 13th century France, and you've fallen in love. Not the arranged, practical attachment your family expects, but real love. The kind that makes your heart race when you see him across the market square, that fills your dreams with impossible hopes. In our world, this would be celebrated, encouraged, perhaps the beginning of a beautiful story. In medieval times, it was evidence of your moral corruption. The Church taught that romantic love was a form of spiritual sickness, a dangerous distraction from proper devotion to God. Passionate feelings between mortals were seen as competition for divine affection, and the Church would not tolerate competition. Love was reframed not as a gift, but as a test, not as joy, but as temptation. Consider the theological writings of Thomas Aquinas, perhaps the most influential medieval scholar. He argued that intense emotional attachment to another person was inherently sinful because it divided the soul's attention from God. Love, in his framework, was a finite resource, and every drop spent on earthly affection was stolen from heavenly devotion. This wasn't merely theoretical. Parish priests across Europe preached weekly sermons warning their congregations about the spiritual dangers of romantic love. Young people were taught to view their own natural feelings with suspicion and fear. The butterflies in your stomach when you saw your beloved, evidence of demonic influence. The joy you felt in their company, proof that you had strayed from the righteous path. The church's definition of appropriate love was so narrow, it was practically non-existent. Even within marriage, couples were instructed to feel only duty and obligation toward each other. Pleasure in physical intimacy was sinful. Emotional closeness was suspect. Joy in your spouse's company was spiritually dangerous. Medieval penitential manuals, the handbooks priests used to assign punishments for confessed sins, contained exhaustive lists of romantic and sexual transgressions. These texts reveal an obsession with controlling every aspect of human emotional and physical intimacy. Couples were told exactly which days they could be intimate, which positions were acceptable, and how they should feel about it. The punishment for loving too much, public penance, social ostracism, and the constant threat of being branded as morally corrupt. Women, as always, bore the brunt of this oppression. A woman who displayed too much affection for her husband might be suspected of lust. One who seemed too happy in marriage could be accused of placing earthly pleasure above spiritual duty. But the church's cruelest innovation was the concept of courtly love, which they initially condemned, but eventually co-opted and transformed into a tool of psychological torture. This literary tradition celebrated impossible, unfulfilled romantic desire as the highest form of love. The idea was that true love could only exist when it was denied, when it caused suffering, when it remained forever out of reach. Think about the psychological impact of this teaching. Young people were told that love was most pure when it was most painful, most noble when it was impossible to fulfill. Healthy, attainable relationships were portrayed as spiritually inferior to tortured, impossible ones. The church had turned love into a form of sanctified masochism. The stories that emerged from this tradition are telling. Lancelot and Guinevere, whose love destroys Camelot. Tristan and Isolde, whose passion leads to death and ruin. These weren't just entertainment. They were instruction manuals for how love was supposed to feel: desperate, destructive, and ultimately doomed. Medieval literature is filled with lovers who choose death rather than consummate their relationships, who find more joy in suffering for love than in actually being loved. This wasn't romantic. It was the systematic programming of an entire culture to fear and distrust their own capacity for happiness. The church also weaponized the concept of spiritual marriage, encouraging both men and women to see themselves as brides of Christ. Now, this wasn't merely metaphorical. It was presented as a literal relationship that precluded all earthly romantic attachments. Young women entering convents went through actual wedding ceremonies, complete with rings and vows, marrying themselves to an invisible divine husband. This spiritual marriage was held up as superior to any earthly relationship. It was perfect because it was one-sided, demanding total devotion, while offering only the promise of eventual reward in the afterlife. It required celibacy, obedience, and the complete suppression of natural human desires. In other words, it was everything the church wanted all relationships to be. The psychological damage this caused was immense. People learned to distrust their own emotions, to view their deepest feelings as evidence of moral failure. They internalized shame about the very experiences that should have brought them joy and connection. Love became associated with guilt, desire with sin, happiness with spiritual danger. Even worse, this system created a feedback loop of dysfunction. People who had been taught that love was dangerous and painful often created relationships that were exactly that. They were suspicious of partners who made them happy, convinced that easy love couldn't be real love. They sought out drama and difficulty, because they had been conditioned to believe that suffering was proof of authenticity. The Church's teachings about love had another sinister effect. They made genuine intimacy nearly impossible. When you're taught that your natural feelings are sinful, when you're constantly watching yourself for signs of spiritual corruption, when you believe that caring too much about another person damns your soul, how can you possibly open your heart fully to another human being? Medieval marriages became exercises in emotional restraint. Couples learned to love carefully, conditionally, always with one eye on the Church's approval. They rationed their affection like it was a finite resource, afraid that too much warmth would attract divine punishment. The result was a culture of emotional starvation in the midst of supposed spiritual abundance. The Church's control over love extended even to the afterlife. Medieval doctrine taught that earthly relationships were temporary inconveniences that would be dissolved in heaven. Married couples were told that their bonds would cease to exist after death, that the love they shared in life was merely a distraction from their true purpose of individual salvation. This teaching served a dual purpose. It diminished the importance of earthly relationships while reinforcing the Church's position as the only source of eternal connection. Your spouse might abandon you in death, but the Church would be there forever. Your children would become strangers in heaven, but your relationship with God through the Church would endure. Perhaps most cruelly, the Church taught that mourning too deeply for lost loved ones was a sign of spiritual weakness. Grief was reframed as a lack of faith, as evidence that you had invested too much emotional energy in temporary earthly relationships rather than focusing on eternal spiritual ones. People were expected to celebrate when their loved ones died, viewing death as a liberation from the sinful bonds of human affection. The medieval Church's approach to love created a society of people who were afraid to feel, afraid to connect, afraid to find joy in each other's company. It turned the most beautiful human experiences into sources of shame and terror. It convinced entire generations that their capacity for love was evidence of their moral corruption. This systematic destruction of healthy human bonding had consequences that extended far beyond individual relationships. It created a culture where emotional authenticity was dangerous, where vulnerability was punished, where the very foundations of human connection were viewed with suspicion. It produced generations of people who were spiritually and emotionally crippled, unable to form the deep bonds that give life meaning. The Church's weaponization of love was perhaps their most effective tool of control because it attacked people at their most fundamental level. You can endure physical hardship, you can survive economic oppression, you can even bear political tyranny. But when you're taught that your own capacity for love is corrupted, when your deepest emotions are turned into evidence against you, when your heart itself becomes the enemy, resistance becomes almost impossible. And so love, which should have been humanity's greatest strength, became its greatest vulnerability. The Church had found a way to turn people's own hearts against them, to make them accomplices in their own emotional destruction. It was a form of psychological warfare so sophisticated that its effects lasted for centuries, shaping Western attitudes toward love and relationships in ways we're still struggling to understand and overcome. The medieval period's approach to love wasn't just restrictive or oppressive. It was actively destructive, designed to cripple the human spirit by attacking its most essential capacity. In the name of spiritual purity, the Church created a hell on earth where love itself became a sin. And the price of that sin was paid in countless broken hearts and stunted souls across the centuries. But if the physical dangers and social constraints weren't enough to crush the human spirit, the medieval Church had one final weapon in its arsenal against love: the complete and systematic demonization of human affection itself. The Church didn't just regulate romance, it declared war on it. transforming the most natural and beautiful human emotions into evidence of moral corruption and spiritual failure. To understand the true nightmare of medieval dating, we must grasp how the Church turned love itself into a sin. This wasn't simply about controlling behavior or maintaining social order. This was about rewiring the human psyche, teaching people to fear and distrust their own hearts, to view romantic desire as a pathway to eternal damnation. The Church's teachings on love were breathtakingly cruel in their psychological sophistication. They began with a simple premise. Passionate love for another human being was inherently sinful because it diverted attention from God. Any emotion that burned too brightly, any affection that brought too much joy, any desire that felt too natural was automatically suspect. The Church taught that true Christians should love God so completely that earthly love would pale in comparison. If you found yourself deeply in love with another person, this was evidence that your spiritual priorities were dangerously disordered. Consider the psychological torture this created for young people experiencing their first romantic feelings. That flutter of excitement when catching sight of someone special, the happiness of shared conversation, the simple pleasure of holding hands. All of these natural responses were reframed as spiritual failures. The Church taught that these feelings were temptations sent by Satan to lead souls astray. Young lovers weren't experiencing something beautiful and human. They were falling into a demonic trap. The Church's treatment of sexual desire was even more brutal. Physical attraction, even within marriage, was portrayed as a necessary evil to be endured rather than enjoyed. Church doctrine taught that the only acceptable reason for sexual intimacy was procreation. Any pleasure derived from physical love was sinful. Any passion was evidence of moral weakness. Married couples were instructed to approach intimacy with shame and reluctance, to view their own desires as corruptions of their spiritual purity. Medieval penitential manuals, the guidebooks used by priests to assign punishments for sins, contained extraordinarily detailed catalogues of sexual transgressions. These texts reveal an obsession with controlling every aspect of human sexuality that borders on the pathological. Couples were told which positions were acceptable, which days of the week they could be intimate, how they should feel about it, and how much pleasure they were allowed to experience, which was essentially none. Women bore the brunt of this sexual shame with particular cruelty. The Church taught that women who enjoyed physical intimacy were especially sinful, as this proved they were controlled by their base animal nature rather than their spiritual side. A woman who showed enthusiasm for her husband's affections, who initiated physical contact, or who seemed to find pleasure in marital relations, was viewed with deep suspicion. She might be accused of being lustful, of leading her husband into sin, or even of being influenced by demonic forces. This created an impossible psychological bind for women. They were expected to submit to their husbands' desires as a religious duty, but they were condemned if they found any enjoyment in this submission. They were supposed to participate in physical intimacy for the purpose of procreation, but they were shamed if they showed any sign of actually wanting this intimacy. The Church had created a system where women were damned if they did, and damned if they didn't, where their very existence as sexual beings was treated as evidence of spiritual corruption. The Church's war on love extended beyond sexuality into the realm of emotional connection itself. Deep friendships, passionate conversations, the joy of shared interests, all of these were viewed with suspicion if they seemed to bring too much happiness. The Church taught that excessive emotional attachment to other humans was a form of idolatry, placing mortal affection above divine love. People were encouraged to maintain emotional distance even from their closest relationships, to love others only insofar as they reflected God's glory. This emotional repression had devastating effects on medieval marriages and families. Couples learned to hide their feelings from each other and from themselves. Parents were taught not to love their children too much, lest this earthly affection interfere with their spiritual development. The natural bonds that should have provided comfort and strength in a harsh world were systematically undermined by religious doctrine that portrayed human connection as spiritually dangerous. The Church's teachings created a culture where genuine intimacy became nearly impossible. How could couples build deep, lasting relationships when they were taught that their feelings for each other were evidence of spiritual failure? How could parents properly nurture their children when excessive affection was viewed as sinful? How could communities develop strong social bonds when emotional connection was treated as a distraction from religious duty? Perhaps most cruelly, the Church taught that suffering in relationships was actually spiritually beneficial. A loveless marriage was seen as an opportunity for spiritual growth through endurance. Unrequited love was portrayed as a form of purification through pain. The Church didn't just accept that love would bring suffering, it actively promoted the idea that this suffering was good for the soul, that romantic pain was a gift from God designed to turn hearts away from earthly desires and toward heavenly ones. This theological framework created what can only be described as a cult of romantic suffering. The Church celebrated stories of lovers separated by duty, of married couples who lived in celibate spiritual partnership, of young people who renounced love entirely to dedicate themselves to religious service. These narratives weren't presented as tragedies, but as spiritual triumphs, examples of souls who had successfully overcome the dangerous temptation of human affection. The tradition of courtly love that emerged in medieval literature can be understood partly as a response to this religious assault on romantic feeling. Since the Church had made actual romantic relationships so fraught with guilt and spiritual danger, poets and storytellers created fantasies of impossible, unconsummated love that could be safely admired without threatening one's salvation. But even these literary escapes reinforce the Church's basic message: that true love was incompatible with earthly life, that the purest affection was that which could never be fulfilled. The psychological damage inflicted by these teachings was immense and long-lasting. Generations of people learned to distrust their own emotions, to view their deepest desires as evidence of spiritual corruption. They internalized shame about their most natural and human responses, creating a society of emotionally repressed individuals who had been taught that love itself was dangerous. The Church's control over marriage ceremonies further reinforced these toxic messages. The religious wedding service emphasized duty, obedience, and spiritual purpose, while carefully avoiding any celebration of love or passion. Brides and grooms were reminded that their union was primarily about serving God and producing children, not about personal happiness or emotional fulfillment. The very language of the ceremony was designed to subordinate human feelings to religious obligation. Even worse, the Church actively interfered in romantic relationships that didn't conform to its standards. Couples who seemed too happy together might be counseled about the spiritual dangers of excessive earthly love. Those who married for obvious affection rather than practical considerations were viewed with suspicion. The Church's representatives had the power to dissolve marriages, separate families, and destroy relationships that were deemed spiritually inappropriate. The long-term consequences of this systematic assault on human affection extended far beyond the medieval period. The Church's teachings about the inherent sinfulness of romantic love created cultural patterns that persisted for centuries, shaping attitudes towards sexuality, marriage, and emotional expression that would plague Western civilization for generations. The idea that passion was dangerous, that emotional intensity was spiritually suspect, that true love required suffering and denial, These concepts became deeply embedded in European culture. As we near the end of our exploration of why dating was a nightmare in medieval times, we must recognize that the Church's war on love represents perhaps the most insidious aspect of this dark period. Physical dangers could be avoided, social constraints could sometimes be navigated, economic hardships could be endured. But the psychological warfare waged against love itself created damage that was nearly impossible to escape. The Church had succeeded in making people afraid of their own hearts, suspicious of their own capacity for joy, convinced that their deepest and most human emotions were evidence of spiritual failure. This was the ultimate nightmare of medieval romance. Not just that love was difficult or dangerous, but that it had been redefined as evil itself. In trying to save souls, the Church had declared war on the very emotions that make us most human. And in that war, as in so many others throughout medieval history, it was ordinary people seeking simple human connection who paid the ultimate price. The Church's systematic assault on human affection didn't end with doctrine and literature. It seeped into the very bones of medieval society, creating a culture where emotional authenticity became dangerous and love itself became a source of shame and terror. The psychological damage was profound and lasting, creating generations of people who learned to fear their own hearts. Consider the plight of young women in medieval convents, many of whom had been sent there not from religious calling, but because their families couldn't afford dowries or had political reasons to remove them from marriage markets. These women, some as young as 12, were forced to take vows of chastity before they even understood what they were renouncing. The Church taught them that any stirring of romantic feeling was evidence of spiritual corruption, that their natural human desires were literally the devil's work. Letters and confessional records from medieval monasteries reveal the torment these women endured. They wrote of dreams they dared not speak aloud, of friendships that felt too warm and had to be severed, of a constant vigilance against their own emotions that left them exhausted and hollow. Many developed what we would now recognize as symptoms of severe depression and anxiety. But medieval medicine attributed these conditions to spiritual weakness or demonic influence. The Church's emphasis on spiritual love over earthly affection created a particularly cruel paradox. Women were told to love Christ with passionate devotion, to be his brides, to experience ecstatic union with the divine. Yet any expression of similar passion toward another human being was condemned as sinful. This created a psychological split that many found impossible to navigate. The very language of spiritual love borrowed from romantic poetry, creating confusion and guilt around feelings that were supposed to be sacred. Men weren't exempt from this psychological warfare. Medieval literature is filled with accounts of knights and nobles torn between their natural desires and religious teachings. The concept of courtly love, which we explored earlier, wasn't just a literary convention but a reflection of real psychological conflict. Men were taught that true love should be suffering, that desire was inherently corrupting, that the highest form of devotion was one that could never be fulfilled. This created what historians now call love melancholy, a recognized medical condition in medieval times. Men who fell genuinely in love were often diagnosed with a form of madness. Medical texts prescribed bloodletting, purging, and even exorcism as treatments for romantic feelings deemed too intense. The message was clear. Love that brought joy rather than suffering was suspect, probably supernatural, and definitely dangerous. The Church's teachings about sexuality within marriage created additional psychological trauma. Couples were told that physical intimacy was only permissible for procreation and should be approached with shame and reluctance. Pleasure was sinful, desire was corrupting, and any enjoyment of marital relations was evidence of spiritual weakness. This created marriages where physical and emotional intimacy were poisoned by guilt and fear. Medieval confessional manuals reveal the extent to which the Church sought to control and regulate every aspect of romantic and sexual life. Priests were given detailed instructions on how to interrogate penitents about their intimate lives, including specific questions about sexual positions, frequency of relations, and whether pleasure had been experienced. The confession booth became a place where private joy was transformed into public shame. The psychological impact on children was particularly devastating. Medieval children grew up in a world where their parents' marriages were often cold and distant, where expressions of affection were rare and suspect, where the very idea of romantic love was associated with sin and danger. They learned early that their emotions were not to be trusted, that desire was evil, and that true virtue lay in suppressing their natural human needs for connection and intimacy. The Church's teachings created what we might now recognize as generational trauma. Parents who had been taught to fear and distrust love passed those fears on to their children. Families became sites of emotional repression rather than nurture. The warm, affectionate family life that we consider normal today was virtually unknown in medieval Europe, replaced by formal hierarchies based on duty and obedience rather than love and care. Women suffered disproportionately from this emotional repression. The Church taught that women were naturally more susceptible to romantic and sexual temptation, making them responsible for controlling not only their own desires, but also those of the men around them. This created enormous psychological pressure. Women learned to minimize their natural charm, to avoid behaviors that might be seen as seductive, and to constantly monitor themselves for signs of inappropriate feeling. The concept of female virtue became so narrow and restrictive that many women developed what we would now recognize as anxiety disorders and depression. They lived in constant fear of stepping outside the boundaries of acceptable behavior, of inspiring desire in men, of being accused of impropriety. The psychological toll of this constant self-surveillance was enormous, creating women who were often withdrawn, fearful, and unable to form genuine emotional connections. The Church's teachings also created profound confusion about the nature of love itself. By insisting that earthly love was inferior to divine love, that romantic affection was a distraction from spiritual devotion, the Church created a false hierarchy that left people unable to understand or value their own emotional needs. Many medieval people lived their entire lives without ever experiencing what we would consider healthy, mutual, romantic love. The damage extended beyond individual psychology to the very structure of society. Communities where emotional expression was suppressed became breeding grounds for suspicion, gossip, and betrayal. People who couldn't express love and affection directly often channeled those feelings into more destructive outlets. Religious extremism, political fanaticism, or persecution of outsiders. The witch trials that plagued Europe from the medieval period through the early modern era can be understood partly as a result of this emotional repression. Communities where natural human desires had been driven underground became obsessed with rooting out supposed supernatural corruption. Women who showed too much independence, intelligence, or emotional warmth became targets for accusations of witchcraft. The very qualities that make relationships meaningful, passion, intuition, emotional depth, were redefined as evidence of demonic influence. The psychological patterns established during the medieval period persisted long after the official doctrine began to change. The Protestant Reformation, while challenging some Catholic teachings, often maintained similar suspicions about romantic love and female sexuality. The idea that passion was dangerous, that pleasure was corrupting, and that emotional restraint was virtuous became embedded in Western culture at a fundamental level. These medieval attitudes toward love created lasting damage that echoed through centuries. The Victorian era's sexual repression, the historical treatment of women as property, The persistent cultural discomfort with female sexuality, and even modern struggles with emotional intimacy can all be traced back to the medieval church's systematic assault on human affection. Perhaps most tragically, the church's weaponization of love robbed countless individuals of one of the most fundamental human experiences, the joy of genuine emotional connection, by teaching people to fear their own hearts, to distrust their deepest feelings, and to view love as a spiritual danger rather than a source of meaning and happiness. The medieval church created a legacy of emotional poverty that would take centuries to overcome. The damage was so profound that we're still healing from it today. Modern therapy often involves helping people overcome centuries-old messages about the dangers of emotional vulnerability, the shame associated with desire, and the false belief that love and spirituality are incompatible. The medieval church's war on love left wounds that have been passed down through generations, creating patterns of emotional repression and relationship dysfunction that persist in various forms even now. Understanding this history helps us appreciate not only how far we've come in recognizing love as a fundamental human right and source of meaning, but also how much work remains to be done in healing the deep cultural wounds created by centuries of teaching people to fear and distrust their own capacity for love and connection. The suffocating grip of superstition cast an even darker shadow over medieval romance than the physical and social constraints we've already explored. In a world where the line between the natural and supernatural remained dangerously thin, love itself became suspect, viewed through a lens of fear that transformed tender feelings into potential evidence of demonic interference or witchcraft. Medieval society lived in perpetual terror of unseen forces. Every unexplained event, every sudden illness, every stroke of misfortune could be attributed to malevolent supernatural intervention. And nowhere was this paranoia more destructive than in matters of the heart. Love, with its mysterious power to transform behavior and inspire seemingly irrational actions, appeared to medieval minds as a force that could only be explained through supernatural means. Consider the plight of Evelina, a young merchant's daughter in 14th century France. When she began displaying the telltale signs of romantic infatuation, gazing dreamily into the distance, losing her appetite, and speaking in passionate whispers about the blacksmith's apprentice, her family didn't see the natural bloom of young love. Instead, they saw the unmistakable symptoms of demonic possession or enchantment. Evelina's father immediately called for the local priest, convinced that his daughter had fallen under a malevolent spell. This wasn't an isolated incident of paranoid overreaction. Medieval medical texts actually described love as a form of mental illness called love sickness or erotic melancholy, symptoms of which supposedly included the very behaviors we now recognize as normal romantic attraction. The influential physician Constantine the African wrote extensively about love as a dangerous disease that could drive sufferers to madness, violence, or death. When someone exhibited signs of romantic passion, medieval society often responded not with understanding or support, but with fear and attempts at supernatural intervention. The church played a particularly sinister role in fostering these superstitious terrors. Religious authorities routinely preached that romantic love represented a dangerous departure from proper Christian devotion. They warned that passionate feelings could open the soul to demonic influence, making lovers vulnerable to Satan's temptations. Young people were taught to be suspicious of their own emotions, to view romantic desire as potentially sinful or even diabolical. This religious paranoia created a climate where expressing romantic feelings became an act of considerable courage. A young man composing love poetry risked being accused of practicing dark arts. A woman who showed too much enthusiasm for a suitor might find herself suspected of witchcraft. The very intensity that makes love beautiful became, in medieval minds, evidence of supernatural corruption. The fear of love magic pervaded every level of society. Wealthy nobles employed food tasters, not just to guard against poison, but to detect love potions that might compromise their judgment in marriage negotiations. Merchants kept careful watch over their daughters, worried that rivals might use supernatural means to manipulate romantic attachments for business advantage. Even peasants lived in terror that their romantic rivals might employ cunning women or wise men to cast spells that would steal away their beloved's affections. These fears weren't entirely baseless within the medieval worldview. A thriving underground economy existed around love magic, with cunning folk, hedge witches, and folk healers offering potions, charms, and spells designed to kindle, enhance, or destroy romantic feelings. While these practitioners were often simply herbalists using natural aphrodisiacs or psychological manipulation, medieval society saw them as wielding genuinely supernatural powers. The consequences of this superstitious terror were devastating for ordinary people trying to navigate romance. Young lovers found themselves caught between their natural feelings and a society that viewed those feelings as potentially demonic. They had to hide their emotions, suppress their passions, and constantly worry that their love might be interpreted as evidence of supernatural corruption. Margaret of Wessex, a 15th century wool merchant's daughter, left behind a diary that provides haunting insight into this psychological torment. She wrote of her love for a young clerk named Thomas, but her entries are filled with self-doubt and terror. She constantly questioned whether her feelings were natural or the result of some malevolent spell. She prayed daily for God to cleanse her heart of what she feared might be demonic influence. When Thomas began returning her affections, she became convinced that she had somehow corrupted him through supernatural means. This internalized fear created a vicious cycle. The more intensely someone experienced love, the more convinced they became that supernatural forces were at work. This led to guilt, self-loathing, and attempts to suppress or deny romantic feelings. Young people were taught to distrust their own hearts, to view their deepest emotions as potential evidence of spiritual corruption. The superstitious terror surrounding love also provided convenient weapons for those seeking to destroy romantic relationships. Jealous rivals could destroy a courtship simply by spreading rumors of love magic. Parents opposed to a match could claim their child had been enchanted. Spurned lovers could seek revenge by accusing their former beloved of practicing witchcraft. These accusations carried terrifying consequences. Suspected practitioners of love magic faced trials that often involved torture designed to extract confessions. The procedures for detecting love magic were barbaric and often fatal. Accused women might be subjected to swimming tests, where they were bound and thrown into water on the theory that witches would float while innocent women would sink. They faced pricking tests, where investigators searched their bodies for supernatural marks that supposedly proved their guilt. Even when formal accusations weren't made, the fear of love magic created an atmosphere of constant suspicion and paranoia. Couples had to be extraordinarily careful about how they expressed their feelings, worried that too much passion might be interpreted as evidence of supernatural manipulation. They lived in fear that rejected suitors or jealous rivals might spread rumors that would destroy not just their relationship, but their reputations and possibly their lives. The documentation from medieval witch trials reveals the devastating impact of these superstitious terrors on romantic relationships. In case after case, we see love affairs destroyed by accusations of magic. Young women were burned at the stake for the crime of being too attractive, too charming, or too successful in matters of the heart. Men found themselves accused of using supernatural means to seduce women above their social station. The trial records of Agnes Waterhouse, executed in 1566 for witchcraft, illustrate this pattern perfectly. Agnes was accused of using magic to make various men fall in love with her. to break up established relationships, and to cause impotence in men who rejected her advances. The evidence against her consisted primarily of testimony that she was unusually successful in romantic matters and that several men had developed strong feelings for her. In a society where female romantic agency was viewed with suspicion, Agnes's apparent ability to attract and influence men was interpreted as proof of supernatural powers. This case demonstrates how the superstitious terror surrounding love particularly targeted women. In medieval thinking, women were seen as more susceptible to demonic influence and more likely to use supernatural means to achieve their goals. A woman who was too beautiful, too charming, or too successful in love automatically became suspect. Female romantic agency was so threatening to medieval patriarchal structures that it was literally demonized. The fear of love magic also created terrible situations for women who were naturally attractive or charismatic. Beauty itself became suspect, viewed as potentially supernatural in origin. Women learned to downplay their appearance and suppress their natural charm, worried that too much success in romantic matters might lead to accusations of witchcraft. This superstitious terror extended beyond individual relationships to poison entire communities. Villages lived in constant fear that cunning women among them might be practicing love magic. Neighbors watched each other suspiciously, looking for signs of supernatural romantic manipulation. The slightest unusual romantic development could trigger investigations and accusations. The psychological impact of living under this constant threat cannot be overstated. Young people grew up learning to distrust their own emotions, to view romantic love as potentially dangerous and possibly demonic. They internalized fears that made genuine intimacy nearly impossible. How could someone fully open their heart when they'd been taught that romantic passion might be evidence of supernatural corruption? These superstitious terrors also created terrible dilemmas for people experiencing genuine love. They had to choose between following their hearts and protecting themselves from accusations of magic. Many chose safety over love, suppressing their feelings and entering into loveless but socially acceptable marriages. Others risked everything for love, knowing that their passion might be interpreted as evidence of demonic influence. The medieval period's superstitious beliefs about love created a perfect storm of terror around the most basic human emotions. The very institutions that were supposed to support and protect relationships became instruments of suspicion and persecution. Love, which should have been a source of joy and connection, became instead a source of fear and paranoia. As we examine this dark chapter in the history of human relationships, we see how ignorance and fear can transform the most beautiful aspects of human experience into sources of terror. The medieval terror of love magic may seem distant and foreign to us now, but its echoes can still be found in modern anxieties about sexuality, romance, and emotional expression. The brave individuals who risked everything for love during these dark centuries, who chose to follow their hearts despite the supernatural terrors surrounding them, represent some of humanity's greatest heroes. They fought not just against social constraints and physical dangers, but against a culture that had literally demonized their deepest emotions. Their courage in the face of such overwhelming fear and persecution stands as a testament to the indomitable power of human love to survive even the darkest and most superstitious of times. The crushing weight of medieval economics made love not just difficult, but often literally impossible to afford. In a world where survival itself consumed every waking moment and every hard-earned coin, romance became a luxury that most people simply could not indulge. The very notion of dating, of spending time getting to know someone without immediate practical purpose, was not merely impractical, but potentially life-threatening to one's economic survival. Consider the daily reality of a typical peasant family in 14th century England. Thomas the ploughman worked from dawn until dusk on his lord's land, earning barely enough to feed his family through the winter months. His daughter Margaret, now 15, represented both a burden and an opportunity. She consumed precious food and resources, but she also possessed the only valuable commodity the family could trade: her fertility and labour potential. The idea that Margaret might choose her own husband based on affection or compatibility was not just foreign to Thomas's thinking, it was economically suicidal. Marriage in medieval times was fundamentally a business transaction, and like all business deals, it required careful negotiation to ensure maximum benefit for both parties. A bride came with a dowry, a payment from her family to her husband's family to help establish the new household. For peasant families, scraping together even a modest dowry could take years of saving, often requiring the entire extended family to contribute. A few chickens, perhaps a goat, some basic household goods, maybe a small plot of land if the family was particularly prosperous. These constituted the life savings that determined whether a young woman could marry at all. But the economic calculations went far beyond the initial dowry. A husband needed to demonstrate that he could support a wife and the children who would inevitably follow. This meant owning or having access to enough land to grow sufficient crops, possessing the tools necessary for farming or whatever trade he practiced, and having a dwelling that could shelter a family. For most young men, acquiring these basic necessities took decades of backbreaking labour and careful saving. Many never achieved economic stability sufficient to support a family, remaining unmarried throughout their short lives. The seasonal nature of medieval agricultural life added another layer of economic complexity to romantic relationships. Marriages were typically scheduled around the agricultural calendar, with most weddings taking place in the fall after the harvest, when food was most plentiful and families could afford to feed wedding guests. But this also meant that courtship had to follow the rhythms of farming life. During planting and harvest seasons, there was simply no time for romantic pursuits. Young people might catch glimpses of each other at market days or religious festivals, but sustained courtship was impossible when every daylight hour was needed for survival. The guild system that governed most urban trades created additional barriers to romantic freedom. Apprentices, who made up a significant portion of young men in medieval towns, were typically forbidden from marrying during their years of training. This apprenticeship could last 7 years or more, meaning that men might not be free to wed until their late 20s or early 30s. Meanwhile, their potential brides were aging past their peak childbearing years, creating a demographic mismatch that left many people permanently single. For women, the economic realities were even more constraining. Medieval law and custom severely limited women's ability to own property or engage in independent economic activity. A woman could not enter into contracts, could not inherit land in her own right in most cases, and was legally considered the property first of her father, then of her husband. This meant that a woman without male protection faced almost certain destitution. Marriage was not a choice, but an economic necessity, and women had to accept whatever arrangements their families could negotiate on their behalf. The concept of romantic love as we understand it today was not just discouraged, but actively dangerous from an economic perspective. Falling in love with someone from a different social class could result in economic ruin for both families. A merchant's daughter who eloped with a peasant farmer would likely be disinherited, while the farmer would face the wrath of powerful families who could destroy his livelihood through economic pressure. Cross-class relationships were not just socially unacceptable, they were economically catastrophic. Even within the same social class, romantic preferences had to be subordinated to economic realities. A young woman might prefer the handsome baker's son, but if the miller's son offered a larger dowry or better economic prospects, her family would choose the miller. Personal attraction, emotional compatibility, and individual desires were luxuries that most families could not afford to consider. The stakes were simply too high. A poor marriage choice could condemn an entire family to poverty or starvation. The economic pressures extended beyond the initial marriage negotiations to affect every aspect of romantic relationships. Married couples had no choice but to have children quickly and frequently, not out of desire for large families, but because children represented economic assets. Sons would eventually contribute labor and income to the household, while daughters could be married off to form advantageous alliances with other families. But children also represented enormous economic risks. Each pregnancy carried the possibility of medical expenses the family could not afford, and each child meant another mouth to feed in a world where food security was never guaranteed. The high infant mortality rate added a particularly cruel dimension to the economic calculations surrounding medieval romance. Families might have 6 or 7 children in hopes that 2 or 3 would survive to adulthood. This meant that the economic investment in children was enormous, but the return was uncertain. Parents had to remain emotionally detached from their youngest children, knowing that attachment to a child who might die could be economically as well as emotionally devastating. For the nobility, economic considerations shaped romantic relationships just as powerfully, though in different ways. Noble marriages were diplomatic and military alliances disguised as romantic unions. A duke's daughter might be betrothed to secure a military treaty, while a baron's son might marry to gain control of strategic territory. The economic stakes were measured not in chickens and goats, but in armies and castles, trade routes and tax revenues. The personal feelings of the individuals involved were irrelevant compared to the political and economic advantages their union could provide. The elaborate courtly love traditions that we associate with medieval romance were actually a response to these harsh economic realities. Because marriage was purely transactional, romantic love had to find expression outside of marriage in the form of adulterous relationships between knights and married ladies. These affairs were celebrated in literature precisely because they represented love freed from economic calculation. But even courtly love came with enormous economic risks. A knight who was discovered in an affair with his lord's wife could lose his lands, his position, and his life. The economic consequences of romantic passion were always lurking beneath the surface, ready to destroy anyone who prioritized love over practical concerns. The Church's teachings on marriage and sexuality further complicated the economic aspects of medieval romance. While the Church promoted marriage as a sacrament, it also taught that sexual desire was inherently sinful and that the ideal Christian life was one of celibacy. This created a cultural tension where marriage was simultaneously necessary for economic survival and spiritually suspect. Young people were caught between the practical need to marry for economic security and religious teachings that suggested their desires were evidence of moral corruption. The economic pressures also meant that romantic relationships had to develop with extraordinary speed. There was no time for the gradual courtship that might allow 2 people to determine their compatibility. Marriages were often arranged and consummated within weeks of the initial negotiations. Couples had to learn to live together, work together, and hopefully love each other after they were already legally and economically bound. The modern concept of dating, of spending time getting to know someone before making a commitment, was an impossible luxury in a world where economic survival demanded immediate and irreversible decisions. For those few individuals who did manage to marry for love, the economic pressures of medieval life often destroyed their happiness quickly. A couple who married based on romantic attraction rather than economic calculation might find themselves unable to support their children, losing their home to creditors, or facing starvation during bad harvest years. Love, no matter how genuine, could not put food on the table or pay the taxes demanded by feudal lords. Many romantic marriages ended in bitterness and recrimination, as economic realities destroyed whatever affection had initially brought the couple together. The geographic limitations of medieval life added another economic barrier to romantic relationships. Most people lived and died within a few miles of where they were born. Travel was expensive, dangerous, and time-consuming. This meant that the pool of potential romantic partners was extremely limited. A young person might know every eligible individual in their village by the time they reached marriageable age, leaving little room for choice or preference. If no suitable matches existed locally, families might have to look to neighbouring villages, but this required economic resources for travel and negotiations that most families simply did not possess. The seasonal famines that regularly plagued medieval Europe created additional economic pressures on romantic relationships. During years of poor harvests, families might be forced to sell their daughters into marriage to whoever could afford to feed them, regardless of age differences or personal compatibility. Conversely, during famine years, no one could afford to take on additional mouths to feed, leaving many young people unable to marry at all. The timing of romantic relationships was thus subject to the unpredictable cycles of agricultural success and failure that governed medieval economic life. The primitive state of medieval medicine meant that any romantic relationship carried enormous potential economic costs. A spouse who became ill or disabled could become an economic burden that destroyed the entire household's financial stability. There was no insurance, no social safety net, no government assistance for families facing medical crises. A romantic choice that seemed economically sound could be rendered disastrous by a single accident or illness. This uncertainty made every romantic decision a high-stakes gamble with the family's economic survival. The legal system reinforced these economic barriers to romantic freedom. Laws governing inheritance, property rights, and marriage were designed to preserve existing economic structures rather than to promote individual happiness or romantic fulfillment. A woman who married without her family's consent could be disinherited, while a man who married above his station could face legal persecution from his wife's relatives. The law was a tool for maintaining economic order, not for protecting romantic rights that were not yet even conceived of as legitimate interests. The craft guild system that governed most skilled trades created its own set of economic barriers to romance. Guild membership was often hereditary, and marriages between guild families were carefully arranged to preserve trade secrets and economic advantages. A carpenter's daughter was expected to marry within the carpentry community, not because of personal preference, but because cross-trade marriages could lead to the loss of valuable economic privileges. Even skilled craftsmen, who were relatively prosperous by medieval standards, found their romantic choices constrained by the economic imperatives of their trades. The constant threat of war added another layer of economic uncertainty to medieval romantic relationships. A young man might be conscripted into military service at any time, leaving his wife and children without economic support. The economic investment in a marriage could be wiped out overnight if the husband was killed in battle or disabled by wounds. This uncertainty made families reluctant to invest heavily in romantic relationships, preferring to keep their economic options open rather than committing resources to arrangements that might be destroyed by the next military campaign. The primitive state of transportation and communication meant that economic opportunities were extremely limited and localized. A couple could not simply move to a new area if economic conditions in their hometown became unfavorable. They were bound to the land and the local economy where their families had established themselves, often over generations. This geographic immobility meant that romantic relationships had to work within very narrow economic constraints, with little possibility of escape if the local economy collapsed, or if better opportunities emerged elsewhere. The seasonal nature of medieval economic life meant that romantic relationships had to be timed around cycles of prosperity and scarcity. Marriages were postponed during difficult economic periods and rushed during times of relative abundance. The emotional rhythms of romance had to conform to the economic rhythms of agricultural life, creating additional stress and uncertainty for couples trying to build relationships under such constraints. The absence of effective contraception meant that every romantic relationship carried the immediate economic burden of potential children. There was no way to separate romantic love from reproductive consequences, and every act of intimacy represented a potential economic commitment that could last for decades. This made romantic relationships extraordinarily high-stakes endeavors where a moment of passion could result in a lifetime of economic responsibility. In this harsh economic landscape, love was not just a luxury, but a potential disaster. The medieval world had no place for romantic idealism or individual desire. Survival required practical decisions based on economic calculation, not emotional attachment. The few who dared to prioritize love over economic security often paid a terrible price, facing poverty, social ostracism, and sometimes death. The economic realities of medieval life made dating, as we understand it, not just difficult but literally impossible for most people. Romance was a game that only the very wealthy could afford to play, and even they played it within strict economic rules that prioritized family wealth and political advantage over personal happiness. As we reach the end of our journey through the romantic wasteland of medieval times, it's worth pausing to consider what all of this suffering actually accomplished. Because in the twisted logic of the medieval world, love wasn't meant to make you happy. It was meant to teach you about pain, about sacrifice, about the fundamental impossibility of finding joy in a world ruled by an angry god and petty nobles. The troubadour tradition that gave us our modern notion of romantic love was built on a foundation of deliberate frustration. The idea that true love should be impossible, that it should hurt, that it should involve years of pining and suffering for someone you could never actually have. This wasn't a bug in the system, it was a feature. Medieval society had turned romantic suffering into an art form. The more impossible your love, the more pure it was considered to be. The more you suffered, the more noble your feelings. A knight who could actually marry his beloved and live happily ever after. That wasn't romantic, that was just practical. Where was the poetry in contentment? This cultural programming runs so deep that we're still infected by it today. How many modern love songs are about happiness versus heartbreak? How many romantic movies end with the couple together versus tragic separation? We've inherited the medieval idea that love should hurt, that if it comes too easily, it's not real love. But perhaps the cruelest irony of medieval romance was how it treated the very people it claimed to celebrate. Women, supposedly the objects of all this courtly devotion, were given no agency in these romantic fantasies. They were prizes to be won, symbols to be worshipped, ideals to be pursued, but never actual human beings with their own desires and preferences. A woman in a medieval love story existed to be beautiful, to be distant, and to inspire men to great deeds. Whether she wanted any of this attention was irrelevant. Whether she was happy was beside the point. She was a muse, not a person, and muses don't get to have opinions about their own lives. The men, meanwhile, were trapped in their own kind of prison. They were expected to be willing to die for love, to throw away practical concerns for the sake of passion, to prove their devotion through increasingly elaborate and dangerous gestures. The pressure to be romantic, to be worthy of love, to demonstrate your feelings through suffering, created its own form of masculine toxicity that we're still dealing with today. Medieval romance gave us the idea that men should pursue women relentlessly, that no doesn't really mean no if you're persistent enough, that true love conquers all, including the beloved's own stated preferences. It romanticized stalking, harassment, and emotional manipulation, wrapping these behaviors in the language of devotion and courtly love. And what of the children born into this system? They grew up watching their parents navigate loveless marriages, seeing romance portrayed as something tragic and impossible, learning that the most important relationships in life were based on duty rather than affection. Is it any wonder that medieval society produced generation after generation of people who seemed incapable of healthy emotional connections? The economic structures that made love a luxury rather than a right created a society where most people never experienced genuine romantic partnership. They might have companionship, they might have mutual respect, they might even develop affection over time. But the idea that marriage could be based on choice, on compatibility, on actual liking each other, was so foreign as to be almost unthinkable. This wasn't just sad for the individuals involved, it was a massive waste of human potential. How much creativity, how much innovation, how much simple human happiness was lost because people were too busy surviving arranged marriages and navigating social restrictions to actually connect with each other. The Church's role in all of this cannot be overstated. By teaching that physical desire was inherently sinful, that romantic love was a distraction from divine devotion, that suffering was spiritually beneficial, medieval Christianity created a perfect storm of sexual shame and emotional repression that would poison relationships for centuries. The idea that celibacy was spiritually superior to marriage, that priests who had never experienced romantic love were qualified to counsel married couples, that sexual pleasure even within marriage was suspect. These beliefs didn't just make medieval dating a nightmare, they created a cultural legacy of sexual dysfunction that we're still working to overcome. But perhaps most tragically of all, the medieval approach to romance robbed people of one of life's greatest joys, the simple pleasure of being chosen by someone who actually knows you. When marriages were arranged by families based on political and economic considerations, when courtship was so heavily supervised that couples barely knew each other before wedding, when the ideal of romantic love was deliberately impossible to achieve, people missed out on the profound happiness that comes from being truly seen and valued by another person. The modern world, for all its flaws, has given us something medieval people could barely imagine: the possibility of finding someone who genuinely likes us for who we are, who chooses to be with us, not because they have to, not because society demands it, not because their family arranged it, but because they enjoy our company and want to share their life with us. We can text someone we're interested in without worrying about being accused of witchcraft. We can meet potential partners without requiring parental permission. We can kiss someone without risking excommunication. We can choose our own spouses based on compatibility rather than dowry negotiations. We can even, revolutionary thought, marry for love. Yes, modern dating has its challenges. Yes, there are still inequalities and problems to work through. But compared to the systematic nightmare that was medieval romance, we're living in a golden age of romantic possibility. The next time you're frustrated with dating apps, or annoyed by someone ghosting you, or disappointed by a relationship that didn't work out, remember Margaret, trembling at her forced wedding to a violent stranger. Remember Isabella, trapped in a loveless political marriage. Remember all the countless medieval women and men who lived and died without ever experiencing the simple joy of choosing their own romantic destiny. Their suffering wasn't meaningless if it helps us appreciate what we have. Their stories aren't just historical curiosities if they remind us how precious and fragile our modern freedoms really are. The nightmare of medieval dating serves as a reminder that love, real love, freely chosen and mutually desired, is one of humanity's greatest achievements. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, in a world where you can love whom you choose, where your heart is your own to give, where romance is a source of joy rather than terror, spare a thought for those medieval souls who dreamed of the very freedoms we now take for granted. Their world was harsh, their choices limited, their hearts constrained by forces beyond their control. But somehow, Despite everything, love persisted. People found ways to care for each other, to create moments of tenderness, to build connections that transcended the brutal circumstances of their lives. In the end, that might be the most beautiful part of their story. Not that they succeeded in creating a romantic paradise, but that they kept trying. Not that they found perfect love, but that they never stopped believing it was worth seeking. As we reflect on these parallel journeys through time, we begin to see the profound connections between the suffering of biblical disciples and the emotional repression of medieval society. Both eras demanded extraordinary sacrifices from ordinary people, whether it was the physical hardships of following an itinerant preacher through the dusty roads of Palestine, or the spiritual torment of denying one's deepest emotional needs in service to an increasingly rigid church hierarchy. The disciples who walked with Jesus experienced a raw, unfiltered form of faith that cost them everything they had previously known. They traded security for uncertainty, comfort for constant danger, and social acceptance for widespread persecution. Yet in their suffering, they found something transformative, something that made every sleepless night under the stars, every empty stomach, every threatening crowd worth enduring. Their faith was forged in the crucible of real experience, tempered by miracles they witnessed firsthand, and strengthened by a community that shared their burdens. Medieval believers, however, faced a different kind of trial. Their suffering was not the natural consequence of following a revolutionary teacher through hostile territory, but rather the manufactured torment of a system that had forgotten the simple message of love that originally motivated those first disciples. The church that emerged from centuries of institutional growth bore little resemblance to the intimate band of followers who had once shared fish and bread with their teacher by the Sea of Galilee. Where the original disciples found strength in their shared hardships, medieval Christians were taught to find virtue in isolation and self-denial. The communal bonds that had sustained Peter, James, and John through their darkest hours were replaced by solitary contemplation and individual guilt. The joy that had motivated Mary Magdalene to follow Jesus despite social ostracism was transformed into the melancholy of courtly love, where happiness itself became suspect and suffering was elevated to an art form. Consider how radically different these two expressions of faith truly were. The disciples experienced poverty as a byproduct of their mission, not as a goal in itself. They went without food because they were too busy healing the sick and preaching to crowds to worry about their next meal. They faced danger because they were challenging the established order, not because they sought suffering for its own sake. Their homelessness was a consequence of their itinerant lifestyle, not a deliberate rejection of earthly comfort. Medieval Christianity, by contrast, made suffering an end in itself. Poverty became a virtue to be pursued rather than a hardship to be endured. Celibacy transformed from a practical choice for traveling missionaries into a universal requirement that denied the fundamental human need for intimate connection. The medieval church took the natural consequences of the disciples' radical lifestyle and turned them into arbitrary rules that applied to everyone, regardless of their calling or circumstances. This transformation reveals something profound about how institutions can corrupt even the most beautiful ideals. The disciples' willingness to sacrifice everything for love became the medieval church's demand that everyone sacrifice love for everything else. The spontaneous community that formed around Jesus was replaced by hierarchical structures that separated clergy from laity, men from women, and the spiritual from the physical. Perhaps most tragically, the medieval period lost sight of the hope that had sustained those first followers. The disciples endured their hardships because they believed they were participating in the transformation of the world. They saw the lame walk, the blind see, and the dead rise. They witnessed a kingdom being born that would overturn every earthly power and establish justice and peace forever. Their suffering had meaning because it was leading somewhere magnificent. Medieval believers, however, were taught that their suffering was simply the price of avoiding eternal damnation. The transformative hope of the disciples was replaced by the fearful compliance of subjects trying to appease an angry deity. Love became obligation, joy became suspicion, and the abundant life that Jesus had promised was postponed indefinitely to some distant heavenly realm. The impact of this shift cannot be overstated. When we trace the development of Western attitudes toward love, sexuality, and emotional expression, we can see how the medieval church's systematic suppression of natural human feelings created wounds that took centuries to heal. The disciples' healthy integration of physical and spiritual reality gave way to a dualistic worldview that saw the body as inherently corrupt and emotions as dangerous temptations. This dualism particularly harmed women, who were often seen as the primary source of temptation and emotional chaos. The medieval church's fear of sexuality and emotional connection created a culture where women's natural expressions of love and affection were viewed with suspicion and often condemned outright. The feminine disciples who had supported Jesus' ministry and been the first witnesses to his resurrection were gradually written out of the story, replaced by male hierarchies that feared and controlled rather than celebrated the full spectrum of human experience. The psychological damage inflicted by this systematic repression rippled through generations. Children grew up learning that their natural desires for love and connection were sinful. Young people were taught to view their emerging sexuality as a source of shame, rather than a gift to be cherished and properly channeled. Adults spent their lives fighting against fundamental aspects of their humanity instead of learning to integrate them in healthy ways. Even the concept of romantic love, which we might think of as a rebellion against religious repression, was shaped by these medieval distortions. Courtly love taught people to find beauty in unattainable longing rather than in mutual fulfillment. It romanticized suffering and made satisfaction seem somehow less noble than endless yearning. These ideas infected Western culture so deeply that we still struggle with them today, often preferring the drama of unfulfilled desire to the quieter satisfaction of genuine partnership. The economic implications were equally profound. When the church controlled not just spiritual life, but also inheritance, marriage, and social mobility, it could use people's deepest longings as tools of manipulation. The natural human desire for love and family became a means of extracting wealth and maintaining power. People were forced to choose between following their hearts and securing their futures, creating a society where authentic emotion was a luxury few could afford. Yet throughout this long, dark period, the human spirit proved remarkably resilient. Love found ways to flourish, even in the most repressive circumstances. Couples discovered ways to express genuine affection within the constraints of arranged marriages. Artists and poets created works of beauty that transcended the narrow confines of official doctrine. Mystics found ways to experience divine love that restored some of the joy and spontaneity that had been systematically suppressed. This resilience points to something the medieval church never fully understood. The same force that motivated the disciples to leave everything and follow Jesus was not fundamentally different from the love that draws two people together in romantic partnership. Both involve self-sacrifice, both require trust and commitment, and both have the power to transform lives in profound ways. The attempt to separate spiritual love from human love was doomed from the beginning because they spring from the same source. As we look back on these two eras, we can appreciate both the courage of the original disciples and the persistence of love throughout history's darkest chapters. The disciples showed us that some truths are worth any sacrifice, that community can sustain us through the worst hardships, and that hope can make even suffering meaningful. The medieval period, despite its repressions, demonstrated that love is stronger than any system designed to contain it. Today, we have freedoms that neither biblical disciples nor medieval believers could have imagined. We can love openly, express our emotions freely, and integrate our spiritual and physical lives in ways that honor both dimensions of our humanity. We can choose our partners based on genuine affection rather than economic necessity or social obligation. We can raise children who see their natural desires as gifts rather than curses. But with these freedoms come new responsibilities. We must not take for granted the courage of those who preserved love through centuries of oppression. We must remember that the freedom to love authentically is not a natural right, but a hard-won privilege that required countless sacrifices from countless people. We must resist the temptation to create new forms of repression, whether religious, cultural, or ideological. Most importantly, we must remember that both the disciples' willingness to suffer for truth and the medieval lovers' persistence in the face of impossible circumstances spring from the same deep well of human longing for connection and meaning. Whether we are following a teacher through the wilderness or pursuing a beloved despite social obstacles, we are participating in the same fundamental human drama that has played out across millennia. The boring Bible, as it turns out, is not boring at all. It is the story of real people facing impossible circumstances with remarkable courage. It is the story of love persisting through repression, hope surviving disappointment, and human connection transcending every barrier erected against it. It is ultimately our story, told in the language of ancient Palestine and medieval Europe, but speaking to truths that remain as relevant today as they were 2,000 years ago. In the end, perhaps the greatest lesson from both the disciples' hardships and the medieval suppression of love is that authentic human connection cannot be destroyed, only temporarily obscured. Like water finding its way around obstacles, love finds ways to flow even through the most restrictive circumstances. The disciples found it in their shared mission. Medieval lovers found it in stolen moments and secret glances. And we find it in the freedoms we too often take for granted. As we drift toward the end of our journey through these turbulent chapters of human history, it becomes clear that the threads connecting biblical discipleship and medieval love are far more intertwined than they might initially appear. Both represent profound human experiences that were systematically challenged, suppressed, and transformed by the very institutions meant to nurture them. The disciples who walked dusty roads with empty stomachs and constant fear in their hearts shared something fundamental with medieval lovers who whispered their affections in shadows, terrified of eternal damnation. They both dared to pursue something transcendent in worlds designed to crush such aspirations. The early followers of Christ sought spiritual connection despite facing starvation, persecution, and death. Medieval hearts sought romantic connection despite facing shame, punishment, and spiritual condemnation. What emerges from both stories is a testament to human resilience that should comfort us as we settle into sleep. Despite every systematic effort to control, manipulate, or destroy authentic human connection, love persisted, faith endured, community survived. Whether expressed through the shared bread of persecuted disciples or the secret glances of forbidden lovers, the human capacity for deep connection proved stronger than any institution's attempts to contain it. Tonight, as you rest in relative comfort and safety, remember that you carry within you the same unbreakable spirit that sustained those ancient disciples through their darkest hours and guided medieval hearts through their most oppressive times. The love they fought to preserve, whether divine or romantic, flows through generations to reach us today. We live in an age where we can speak freely about both our spiritual longings and our romantic desires, where we can gather in communities of faith without fear of martyrdom, and where love is celebrated rather than condemned. This freedom didn't emerge by accident. It was paid for by countless individuals who refused to let their deepest human experiences be extinguished by systems of control. So, as your breathing slows and consciousness fades, let yourself be grateful for the ordinary miracle of being able to love and believe without fear. Rest peacefully, knowing that the same force that carried disciples through persecution and lovers through oppression continues to sustain the human spirit today.